All right, our speaker is here. This is a man who really does not need introductions. I had the pleasure, not every day, but the pleasure of serving with Larry Summers in the Clinton administration. We both left that and joined the world of the academy. I think both of us found the world of the academy a challenging experience. Washington is challenging, but running an academic institution is even at times more challenging. He has been head of the NSC, president of Harvard, Treasury Secretary, chief economist of the World Bank, tenured professor at the age 28. So this is a man who has added a lot of cachet to his resume, and that's not just his return to Harvard. I'm talking about the fact that he was in the movie The Social Network. Clearly a reason that movie won an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. That moment, that scene, I actually had seen the movie the opening weekend and had a meeting with Larry the following Monday and urged him to rush to see that. So, over this time, Larry has become a great, I consider him a personal friend, a good friend, a counselor and advisor, and he did a lot in the early days of the Obama administration in counseling me and us on how we could request additional funds to do a better job for small business, a better job for exporters, and that very much directly impacted our budget requests that were ultimately approved by the White House. We're hoping Congress will enact them, but Larry Summers was very much at the blueprint stage of having us organize our thinking on that. So I am personally indebted to Larry, and let me bring him up to the stage. He said, I really like Q&A, so we're going to do some questions and answers after, but please join me in welcoming Larry Summers to the stage.
Fred, thank you very much for that warm introduction. I can say that having spent a few years as the president of Harvard, I am one of very few people who comes to work in a new presidential administration in order to get out of politics. Think about that. And some of you may have read that I can be arrogant. If that's true, I was when I met the Winklevi. In fact, I take modest pride in the fact that the Winklevi were quoted as saying, the movie was pretty accurate, except Larry Summers wasn't nearly that nice to us. But you know, the fact that Facebook is worth more today than General Motors plus Chrysler plus another 25% tells you something about the ways in which the global economy is changing. And that's what I want to talk about for just a few minutes in providing some perspective for why I think the work of the Ex-Im Bank and the work of all of you is so important. A question that I always find helpful to ask is project yourself forward in history, look back at our time, and ask what it is that will be most important. I think there are two things that will be most important about this moment when historians look back on it. The first will be the rise of China and other emerging markets. Think about this. It took from the time of Pericles and Athens until 1800 in London for standards of living to rise by 75%, 2,300 years. During the time when our country grew most rapidly, around the turn of the 20th century, it took a generation for standards of living to increase by that much. In substantial parts of Asia today, in places where more than a third of humanity live, it takes about 8 years for standards of living to rise as much as they did from the time of Pericles until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. At current rates of growth, we're going to see more growth over the next 40 years in Asia than we've seen in the United States since the beginning of the Revolutionary War. That is a change that will change literally everything in history. It is a change that, yes, carries with it enormous risks to global security, to the global environment, to the order we are used to. But it is also, as I'll discuss, a change that carries with it spectacular opportunity for those who can seize it. There's a second change in this moment, which is a change in the nature of production and the nature of the way in which economies function. Perhaps for me, it was best symbolized by the Economist magazine's cover several weeks ago, which had a picture of a Stradivarius on it, and it said that that Stradivarius could, in a sense, be printed. That just as there was once a time when it didn't really matter what you wrote, you just wrote, and then it got printed, and the content of what you wrote didn't matter. They could print anything equally well. If you could conceive it, they could print it. We're getting to the point where if you can design it, it can be produced by a machine. That is part of a much larger trend, that products are increasingly defined by the knowledge that is embodied in them rather than the particular effort in producing them. If the canonical good in the agricultural era was a bushel of wheat, and the canonical good in the industrial era was what economics courses called a widget, but what people imagined as an ingot of steel, the canonical good going forward is going to be a book or a movie or a pharmaceutical or a sophisticated bit of equipment that was defined not by the act of producing it, but by the act of conceiving and designing it. That world, a world in which wealth comes from knowledge and knowledge can move across international borders at an enormous rate, a world in which for the first time there really is a truly global economy, because everybody can trade with everybody, and because the convergence process is happening so quickly, is going to be a very different world than the world most of us grew up in, and it is going to demand a very different type of economics. What is that economics? There are some, fewer frankly than there were 4 years ago, who believe that it is an economics without an important public sector, in which the principal task of the public sector is to stay out of the way. You look at what just happened in Japan. You look at the financial earthquake that has taken place in the United States. You look at the financial earthquake that will take place in Europe with probability 100% without strong public action. It is hard to believe that without a public sector that does the public things that is necessary for a public sector to do, that economies are going to function, prosper, and work for ordinary citizens in the way that they should, in the way that they can. There's another vision. It's also a vision that would have been more prevalent some years ago than it is today, that holds that somehow we're moving into a post-market era, that there is so much that needs to be coordinated and managed and planned, that the public sector needs to run all kinds of things that it did not once run. anyone who has looked at Poland then and now, anyone who looks at South Korea and North Korea today, anyone who looks at some of the excesses of what has happened in Western Europe cannot really subscribe to that notion. So that new economics has to have elements that are different. It is not public sector or private sector. It is public sector and private sector. It is not an economics that is based only on what happens within a single nation or a single market. It is not even a unit where the individual nation is the right unit of economic analysis. It is an institution that has to be based on the right kind of partnership between the public sector and the private sector. A role in which the public sector is prepared to do what's necessary to facilitate coordination by the private sector. A role in which the public sector in any nation has an obligation to make sure that the private sector of that nation is not put at an unfair disadvantage by the subsidy policies of others. A role in which it is recognized that there are investments, there are activities where the private gain is much less than the public purpose. No one captured, Henry Ford did not capture anything like all of the benefits that existed from Detroit being the world center of the automobile industry for 50 years between 1920 and 1970. No one who was involved in founding Silicon Valley was able to capture all of the benefits that came from its remarkable capacity to generate wealth. And that is why a public sector catalytic role is so important in a modern economy. In a modern economy that is defined in the way I defined it, in substantial part by the fact that the real effort in products is designing them, not producing them. The larger a market you can reach, the more efficient you can be. You know, it's an interesting fact about economics. It's sort of a paradox. When you take your economics course, they tell you about supply and demand, and they tell you that when there's more demand, the price goes up. Only one thing. Which is cheaper if you walk into a bookstore? A bestseller by Tom Friedman, or an academic tract about, an econometric heteroscedastic approach to blah blah by Larry Summers? I'd suggest, I've learned something from this, by the way. I'd suggest to you that the book by Tom Friedman's a lot cheaper, even though there's a lot more demand. It's not the way they taught it when they taught supply and demand. But why is it? If all the cost is basically in the design and the conception, then the larger the market you can have, the cheaper the product will be, the larger the profit margin will be. So in this new world, enlarging markets is much more important than it used to be, and therefore the gains from greater exports are much more important than they ever used to be. That's why I was proud to advise President Obama that he should set a goal of doubling U.S. exports over the next 5 years. That's why I'm proud to be able to tell you that 1 year in, we are well over a fifth of the way there. That's why that serves as an organizing principle for enforcing our trade agreements more vigorously. That's why that serves as an organizing principle for our hard work to reach new trade agreements, like the one concluded with Korea. That's why competitiveness was a focus in the State of the Union address. And that's why the right kind of cooperation between the U.S. government and exporters, the right kind of catalytic finance, has always been important, but has never been more important than it is right now. That's why I'm able to say to you that if we double exports over the next 5 years, I would be very surprised if we do not see the level of unemployment come substantially downwards. And if we are not successful in heavily enhancing exports, I would be very surprised if we do achieve our employment goals as a country. That's why your work as exporters is important for your companies, it is important for your employees, it is important for the stakeholders in your regions. But I can honestly tell you, after a time when the U.S. economy has been tested as it never was since the Second World War, and in a world where the United States is going to have to make its way in very different circumstances than ever before, your work is profoundly important to the future of our country. Thank you very much.
If you have questions, if you raise your hand, we'll get you a mic, and we'll have time for a bunch of questions from the audience. I see one all the way in the back, and there's a microphone right next to you.
My name is Walter Jurasek. My question to you is, how can you compete with manufacturers in China when the labor is much cheaper in China than United States? And the next question, how can you bring the manufacturers to United States to increase unemployment? This is very critical. The cheap labor versus the more expensive labor in the United States.
Tell you what I think's going to happen, and you know, these kinds of economic, I don't know whether they charged admission for this conference. If they did, this kind of forecast is not worth what you're paying for it. If it was free, then this kind of forecast is worth about what you paid for it. I think it is more important than sometimes it's regarded as being to distinguish between manufacturing employment and manufacturing. It is going to transpire, it is already transpiring in a number of industries, that you don't really need that many people. If the whole thing's being done by robots, it doesn't really matter if wages are lower in China than they are here. If you're closer to the market here, if there are better repairmen for the robots here, if there's closer cooperation between the designers of the robots and the conceivers of the product here, you will see manufacturing move back here. And so I would suggest to you that the idea of locating manufacturing for cheapest labor cost was a defining idea for the last quarter century and will still be very important in going forward in some industries, but it may actually be less important than it has been historically. That as labor becomes a smaller and smaller fraction of value, there becomes the possibility of having more and more production here. Now, that is both good news and bad news, and it's important to understand the sense in which it's both. It is good news if what you're focused on is the American manufacturing sector. It is good news if what you're focused on is the American capacity to export. and it is a real thing around the reshoring phenomenon is, for this reason, a real thing. If the reason you thought you cared about bringing back manufacturing was in order to create manufacturing jobs, then the news that manufacturing is coming back because labor cost is becoming less important provides very little consolation. And indeed, I think one of the things we are going to have to recognize as a country is that the world is changing in fundamental ways. As I speak to you right now, the fraction of American workers who are engaged in manufacturing production is 5%. The usual number that's quoted is that about 10 or 11% of the workforce is in manufacturing, but that includes the executive assistants, that includes the people who do the finance, that includes the people who do the distribution, the people who do the marketing. If you actually ask what is production, you're at 5%. You're not far off of where farming was within our lifetimes. That's reality. And so reality is going to be that as we think about employment generators, as we think about competitiveness and we think about exports, we are right to think about manufacturing coming home. But as we think about employment generators, look, China has had this fantastic and spectacular success, and there are fewer Chinese workers in manufacturing today than there were 15 years ago in China, with their low labor costs and with their tremendous increases in competitiveness. What's that about? That's about what happens when you have this spectacular productivity growth. So yes, manufacturing in America, yes, it will be catalytic, important, driving for our exports, but we need to think beyond production work as a driving and dominating source of employment creation. Yes? Yeah. Looking around, yeah. Standing up, that's what I mean.
Thank you for your comments and observations. There's two things I wonder. I work in the federal government. I work for the Commodity Credit Corporation, part of U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I like what you said about, I think it was less important will be the private gain, but more like, say, working in partnership for the public good or purpose. I'm wondering how in the next 5 years we do a better job of communicating between government workers and the private sector and business. I think sometimes that gets in the way of those efficiencies that the chairman has talked about. I wonder even if there's, an idea where I've done details in the government where we can do details across private and public sectors to increase that communication efficiency.
I think it's a complicated problem that you raise, because there are two broad strands of what's desired in our society. One is that there be closer partnerships, that there be closer cooperation, that it be less adversarial, that there be more mutual understanding, that on the one hand, you don't see the kind of vilification of public sector workers that we've seen in Wisconsin, that on the other side, you see more appreciation from the public sector that business is playing a very important function in our society. That's one very strong urge people feel, and it's right. Another very strong urge that people feel is you got to be very careful about the mixture of money and politics. That's why it's wildly popular that presidents' changes in policy with respect to the role of lobbyists in the government, the president's insistence on increases in transparency, on sunlight around various dialogues. That is also widely popular, and it also responds to what is a very real, felt concern that is out there. And there's a deep tension between the two, because, when you start It's a little hard to explain how, okay, so let me get it. We really can't have meetings with business people anymore unless there's sunlight towards them. But we're really going to try to encourage workers to do temporary details within the corporations they cooperate with. It's kind of a complicated message, and that's the problem. And I wouldn't presume to know exactly what the answer is. My guess is that it would be profitable to take the temperature down on both sides. I had a tendency when businesses came to visit me to listen very hard to whatever their concerns were, but to try at some stage to remind them of John Kennedy's inaugural address, the bit about America doing for you and you doing for America. And I think if a larger fraction of business community representatives, when they came to Washington, were able to focus on what they were going to do for America rather than what they needed America to do for them, I think it would take the temperature down in some very important ways and enable more of the desirable things that you describe. At the same time, I think that there's a tendency of some who work in government to believe that they have some monopoly on virtue. And I at least have always believed that somebody who starts a successful company or serves as the steward of a successful company that creates jobs, that generates income for large numbers of working families, or even small numbers of working families that are growing numbers of working families. I think that's public service too. And I think if we were able to reflect that from Washington, and we were able to do that in both directions, we might be able to take the temperature down a bit and permit a happier kind of relationship of the kind you're looking for. Yes?
Mr. Summers, thank you very much for being here, and thank you, Chairman Hochberg. We've had, in this conference, we've had CEOs of major corporations, we had small business owners, we had bootleggers and politicians, now we have an economist, and they've been really inspiring.
I like the order in which you put those.
I'd like to know, and it's been really inspiring hearing you, what's the difference between you and all the other economists that we had in history, and why should we continue being inspired by what you just said?
You know, I do this a moderate amount, and since I do this kind of thing a moderate amount, it's not that often that I get asked a question that I have never been asked before. So Fred probably planted it. That would be in character for him. So I'm trying to think about how to answer your question. The egomaniac, the inner egomaniac in me would answer the question by saying, no, there's really no difference. You know, there was Adam Smith, and there was John Maynard Keynes, and there was David Ricardo, and there's Larry Summers. That's what the inner egomaniac in me would say. The wise guy would say, would quote Keynes about how the economics profession could look forward to the day that it surely hasn't reached when it was seen as earnest purveyors of a particular craft and bit of information in the way that dentists were. That's another way of answering the question. I guess another way of answering the question would be to say that actually there's a big difference between, this is a half serious answer, maybe 75% serious, that there's a big difference between economic theories and physical theories. There is a world and apples do fall from trees, they don't fall from trees, light does refract and reflect and do all those things, and it really wasn't changed at all because of anything Newton did or Einstein did or anything else in the derivation of the theories. And then economics is really kind of different because the way the economy actually functions is, and the way to understand the system actually is affected by the theories that are developed and by the ways in which those theories are internalized and by what human beings do. And therefore, you might someday get to the end of thermodynamics, but you're not actually going to get to the end of economics. And so people like you are going to be cursed to listen to people like me for forever, because there is this constant dialectic where once things become understood, then they're acted on, and that then changes the world, and then you need some different theory for how the world operates. So that would be my way of thinking about the process. Yeah?
Thank you, Professor Summers. My question is that in terms of the significant opportunity and breakthrough that we're going to see as a result of export out of the US, I wanted to know how sub-Saharan Africa in general and in Nigeria in particular can tap into this opportunity vis-a-vis, instead of exporting finished goods, how we can have more export of capital goods that can create employment in sub-Saharan Africa and reduce unemployment rate and poverty.
The question was about sub-Saharan Africa in general and Nigeria in particular. I was, I'm not sure of this, but I think there's a quite strong case to be made that we're headed into the best period of economic performance for Africa in absolute terms and in relative terms ever. If you think about it, in the totality of it, the last 4 decades have not been happy in Africa. When I went to junior high school and high school in the late 1960s, we were taught, it was what they said in our social studies classes, that Africa was really going to take off and that it was really in doubt whether Asia would be defined by famines in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. If you read the consensus opinions, they would have been that Ghana would far outstrip Thailand. That in 1965, it would have been felt that Nigeria would outstrip South Korea. And those examples could have been multiplied, and it's just didn't happen remotely that way. I was very struck, a little bit because of the source, a little bit because of the quality of the analysis, and a little bit because it touched on things that I had seen in other places, by a report that was issued maybe a month ago by Willem Bouter, who is the very distinguished guy who is the chief economist now of Citigroup, in which he attempted to do a set of world economic forecasts going out, I don't remember, to 2040 or 2050. And he predicted the growth rate for every region in the world. And the region in which he saw the most rapid growth by a significant margin was sub-Saharan Africa. And that was a reflection of a few things. It was obviously a reflection of the fact that the lower your base, the easier it is to achieve a fast growth rate. It was a reflection of the fact that in a basically successful world economy, the relative price of commodities is likely to increase substantially, and sub-Saharan Africa is long commodities. It was a reflection of the potential locomotive effects coming from what happened in South Africa for other parts of the continent. It was a reflection of the fact that the intense Chinese interest in sub-Saharan Africa, albeit motivated more by a desire for commodity access than for altruistic motive, and the reaction that was likely to generate from others, that competition was likely to benefit sub-Saharan Africa. And it was a reflection of a reading that in a number of parts of the continent, there were basically favorable internal dynamics. Now, I'm old enough to have seen false dawns in sub-Saharan Africa before, and to have seen false dawns in Nigeria before. But it was an impressive report, and it was an impressive report in part because it tapped into a lot of thinking that's around in a lot of different places. So I think there's a really quite compelling case for optimism, and in a way that has not been true for a long time, there will be fortunes made in sub-Saharan Africa over the next 2 decades. What is important for sub-Saharan Africa? It's the list that has been important for a long time. If I had to emphasize one word, it would probably at this moment be transparency. Not because transparency is in itself other than an abstraction, but because it's really very difficult to be corrupt in the sunlight, because it is much more likely that opportunities that are widely visible will be seized than that they will not be seized, and because there's a world that is looking at 3%, 3.5% on U.S. 10-year money, and looking for places to put money to work where you can do better than that, and 3.5% is not that hard to beat. And therefore, if you can create an open and transparent environment, you can attract more capital more easily than would have been the case at any other time. And so there are a lot of things to talk about. You can talk about education, you can talk about healthcare, you can talk about infrastructure. But in some sense, a lot of that would naturally flow if you could have more transparency and a better environment in which institutions can function. If I could just say a final word before he moves on to the next stage of the program. I should have said it before. The United States is lucky to have Fred Hochberg directing the Export-Import Bank. He is doing a terrific job.
I have one question. Thank you. I have a request and a question. One, I haven't done this before, but I'm inviting you back next year, so I'm hoping that a tentative yes, based on your schedule, and US Air. One of the things we've talked about at the conference is how export credits are used both offensively and defensively, and particularly with countries that aren't part of the OECD, and how we deal with that. Do you have any thoughts that you could share with our audience? And then we will move to the next session.
Fred is a brilliant bureaucrat. Let me explain to you what just happened. Administrations in, administrations out. The Ex-Im Bank is, not perhaps surprisingly, enthused about export lending and looks for justifications to export lend. And there is always a debate between those who want to have a subsidy war across all countries and those who want to have disarmament and try to reduce the subsidies everywhere and want the United States to set an example. And the head of Ex-Im Bank is always on the side of aggressive subsidies, albeit in a prudent and effective environment. And academic economists and people like that are always more skeptical. And so what Fred is doing is taking advantage of the general warmth of this moment and the general force of all of your personality to get me further on the record on his side than I have been before. And he's being cheered on by his chief of staff right here, who thinks this is a brilliant tactic. And everything I say can and will be used against me in the future and in any subsequent debate in which I find myself. So Fred, what I support is a prudent, balanced, and measured approach to export subsidies that responds to a dynamic and evolving global economy in careful coordination and cooperation with all our trading partners and competitors. Thank you very much.